guys, it's Robin, RSI Crafts, and welcome to my craft room. Today we are going to talk about the disappearing 9 patch. Now if you guys are a beginner quilter and you're looking for something to make, you can always just make a simple 9 patch and I'll show you what that looks like. If you've already mastered the 9 patch or you just want to skip that and go on to something a little bit more creative, you can go ahead and try the disappearing 9 patch. Now I'm going to show you a couple things today, but you can also go to Pinterest, and if you search on there for disappearing 9 patch or even disappearing 9 patch variations, you're going to see a variety of different quilts that you can make. When you take this 9 patch, we're going to cut it all up and then we're going to sew it all back together. Because as quilters, we take perfectly good fabric, we cut it all up, and we stitch it together. And then today, we're going to cut it all up again and stitch it together one more time. And for any experienced quilters that are hanging out with me today, you can go ahead and play with color and design. You can try different layouts and see what things will look like. Or if you just want something quick and easy to use up all your scraps, you can just go ahead and stitch this together. Play around a little bit with the layout and you'll have a fine quilt, baby quilt, toddler quilt, kid quilt, adult quilt, grandpa quilt, anything you need. The smaller the squares, the smaller the quilt. If we make it our squares, our beginning 9 patch nice and large, we're going to get through this really quick. So let's quit rambling and let's get started. So first of all, you have seen my husband's disappearing 9 patch that I'm making him for a lap quilt. This is just simple using 2 different fabrics. The one I'm going to show you that I'm currently working on right now is for a baby quilt. I'm using the leftovers from when I was making bibs and burp cloths for one of my customers. So let me show you what fabric I'm using. I've already gotten a little head start and I've made mine into 9 patches. This was not yardage. I was sent a fat quarter of this, a quarter yard of that, a half a yard of this, and some of that. And what I've decided to do is I just took the smaller pieces that were like cut off in the weird angles when I was doing when you're doing a bib, you're just kind of cutting a little bit of a rectangle square, and I did the long strips for the burp cloths. And while doing that, I also still saved some of my larger pieces of the same fabric, because I thought I would go ahead and try to see if I can get enough of this to piece for the back. I don't mind piecing backs. When you're a scrappy quilter, it's something you're used to. So I did save some of my larger pieces, but as you can see, they all have straight edges. The fabric that I used for my 9 patches were like, there was a chunk sticking here and nothing here, and then a chunk there, or I might have had a weird angle. So if you have pieces of fabric like that, you can always cut them up into different squares and make yourself a scrappy disappearing 9 patch. Now I didn't have enough to make unique blocks all the time. As you can see, there are duplicates within the block sometimes. But since I'm going to be cutting this and hacking it up, they're all going to get dispersed, and it's not going to bother me if a couple fabrics stick together. And I'll show you what I mean when we start splitting things around. So I just had a variety. I cut mine into 4.5-inch squares because my main strips of fabric that I had left over were just over 4.5 inches. So I thought, well, that's a perfect size to use. After I stitched my 4.5-inch blocks together, it gave me a 12.5-inch block. And we're going to be, like I said, chopping it all up, so it will get smaller. So if you want to get through this process a lot quicker, start with bigger blocks. If you're making a larger quilt, sometimes it's better to start with a 5 or a 6-inch block to begin with for your 9 patch. And maybe you only want to make a small wall hanging, so you can always drop down to even 2.5-inch blocks. You're going to be working with a lot of smaller fabrics that way, but if you're looking for an extra challenge, sometimes it's fun to do. If you're making placemats, you might want to go down to 3.5 inches. Wall hangings, table runners, you can use this for anything. It's good practice is to make a little doll quilt. You can make it for, your nieces or your granddaughters or your grandsons, because, boys love to take dolls and wrap them up in blankets too. You just might not want to use this fabric. The babies that I was making my things for were gender neutral, which I had a lot of these grays, and then a little girl. So these worked together really well. So here's some of my leftover squares, and as I said, I just laid them out willy-nilly. Just kind of went, let's just stick some things there. And as you can see, I didn't even worry about the direction, because a lot of times we're gonna flip-flop things around, so you're not gonna have them in the upright position anyway. So it's just like that. You can go ahead and make stacks and stacks of these. I believe I made 10 squares. So I just went ahead and I made piles of it like this. I would make my 9 patch here off to the side. And then I'd say, okay, I like that. So then I would leave it like that. And then I could either stack my next 9 patch on top, or I can make this on this side and I can keep my finished ones over here. So I can move these to the new pile so I know that I've got 9. And then I can just keep stacking them up to the left while I figure out how I want them to look over here. I'm not that particular. When I'm doing something scrappy, it's all going to get mixed up anyways. So I just kept stacking mine up. And when I was done, I just made sure I had 10 fabrics in each of the 9 positions. Got to the sewing machine, stitched them all together. And there's my 9 patch. It's a little bit big, it doesn't fit in the screen. So now I have 10 of these. Now as you can see, not all of my seams were perfectly matched up. The way I'm going to be moving this around and everything, it's not going to be a glaring detail. If you're using maybe really sharp contrasting fabrics, you might notice this if you're using like a red against a white or something. But I wasn't too worried about this little bit. I did the best I could to get them all together, but sometimes they just got a little out of whack, and I'm okay with that. Because as I said, we're going to mix this all up and no one's going to notice. The next step in our process is the crazy step. We are going to now take this perfectly good square and we are going to chop it in half. We're going to ignore these tape on here. I've been doing other projects, so I like to put a little bit of, this is a ruler tape. You can use washi tape. It just comes off and it doesn't leave any residue. And I like to put it just past the line that I'm going to be cutting at. So I was cutting a lot of 2.5 inch strips. So I just went just past the line so I can line my fabric up. I want to be able to see that line. And it just made it so much easier for me to cut my strips. So now whatever your finished size is, you're going to need to find the halfway point. So if you have a 12-inch square, you're going to need 6 inches. If you have a 15-inch square, you're going to go in 7.5. In my first cut, it's not going to matter if I cut up and down or side to side, but I'm going to go ahead and cut my square that way, and I'm not going to move anything. I'm going to leave it just like that so that I can come over and I can cut it crosswise. I got to come over to the other side of you because I'm right-handed and I couldn't cut that way. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut this crosswise. If you've been cutting your fabrics for a while, making a few quilts, you might want to go ahead and put a new rotary blade in because we are going to be doing a lot of cutting here. Now as you see, I now have 4 pieces. Now each of my pieces ended up measuring about 6 1/4. At this point, you see I didn't trim up my large square because my only concern is the center square being cut in half. Where these edges ended up didn't bother me. Now at this point, if your squares have little extra pieces sticking out and they're a little bit, where's mine? So I have this little itty bit down here that might be sticking out. I can go ahead and take my little square ruler, figure out the average of my squares. If I'm coming out ended up being 6 1/4, then I can just go ahead and lay it down and trim off any extra and make sure these are all squared up. These are the pieces that are going to be going into our finished quilt. So we want to make sure that these are the ones that are nice and squared up. So I haven't cut all of mine yet, but I have cut a bunch. Now this is going to be really helpful if you have a design wall right now, or a spot on the floor or a bed where you can lay these out and see how everything looks to make sure you're dispersing everything neatly. I just kind of mixed everything up. I didn't worry about keeping everything in their own little pile per square. And then you can just sit here and have some fun. Now I have my square. This is my center square. I know that because it has the 2 narrow pieces here. So when I was playing with it, I noticed if I put narrow piece up and narrow piece down, narrow piece up, and narrow piece down. Well, you can't see that, so I'll leave this here, just these 3. Now, have you noticed that there are no seams that are going to be matching up here? Now you could play with your color. You might not want to have these two pinks that close or that one there. But because all my 9 patches had, most of my 9 patches had 2 of the same fabrics in them, if not 3 sometimes, just because of the scraps I was using, I'm not going to worry too much if things are together. I'm not going to want any of them so that they're too close together like this to give me a big giant chunk. But we can always pull this one out. Now we got polka dots. Pull that one out and bring that one in. Now I have these 2 that are touching, so well, maybe that might bother me too. No big deal. Put that guy in there. Now I have a lot of grays here, and I'm fine with that. And I've got my pinks here that are touching, because that's the way my square went together, and I'm okay with that. But see, now I have, here's a seam here, and here's a seam down here. So if I kept rotating them from the narrow up, narrow down, narrow up, then it keeps everything flip-flopping, and I don't have to worry about anything matching up. So now you've matched up your 9 patch reasonably well. Now you don't have to worry about that anymore. That's why this is a great one for beginner quilters. You just got to be careful that you don't want to have any of these seams matching up, because then you're getting those full chunks anyways. So I had, let me see, a narrow up. Now if I put the narrow down here, then I've got these seams matching up. So if I put the narrow up, and now I have my center over towards here to the right where it was to the left over there. Sometimes you might find some squares that are gonna, see I put the narrow down and it's still gonna match up here. So that's not gonna work. I can just pull that one out and find one that is going to work. So it just has this center square, ends up bouncing in different places, and then you can just bring your, just got to find one, that's all. I guess it would be easier if you put your stacks, you could always organize your fabrics so you have all of them where the main square is in the bottom left, and then where the main square is in the bottom right, so off to the side, so when you need to grab them you can do that. Or you can just go willy-nilly like me and just say, well, this one works or this one doesn't work, let me try a different one. And then now we're going to be sewing our seams together like this when we're making our quilt, but each individual block, when we make our rows, there's no seams to sew together. So I really like the way this works. This one I'm going to make is the baby quilt. It's going to be all hodgepodge and crazy like that. But let me show you one of the neat variations you can do. I've made this bright and funky one as an example today. Now as you can see, I have 4 of my bright squares in the corner, and I have a center, and then I have white. I wanted my center to be different than my corners, and I wanted a nice bright white to go around, and I'll show you why. Because when we cut this in half, these 4 corners are always going to stay whole, because we're not cutting these, we're only cutting the things that are in the center, right? So let's cut this guy and see what happens. I got baby squares everywhere over here. Once again, I went with the 4.5 inch squares. I'm going to carefully and gently move it and make sure everything lines back up before I cut. Just because that way I don't have to walk around the table. Okay, so here we go. We've got them all cut, right? Now do you notice that now this novelty fancy square now has sashing on it? So you could line up your blocks like this. Let's see. And now you've just created sashing for your blocks with the little, I don't know if these are cornerstones or what they are, but now you've got that situation going on. So if you use some fun novelty fabric, and then you can go ahead and have sashing. You can make this a solid color. I just didn't have a color that went well with this for this example. So I don't know about you guys, but when I started quilting in the beginning, I had the hardest time. I would sash all my strips and all my rows, and that was fine. But when I had to go ahead and fold this row onto this one and get this to line up evenly, until I learned how to pin properly, it was very difficult to do. But if you want the same effect and you don't want to have to do any of the work, there you go. Now the only thing here is you are going to have to line up seams on this one. But that's not really a problem. You just have to be careful and make sure everything lines up neatly so you have that flow. But now you can whip out a quilt like this and it's going to look like you really worked hard and really fancy, but all you did was made a 9 patch and chopped it in 2/4, right? So I've always thought this was a really fun one for an I Spy quilt and to showcase whatever fabrics you have here. So this is a really cool variation. So I hope that gave you guys some ideas and different ways to play with the simple, easy 9 patch. If you went ahead and joined me over on Patreon and you're part of the $15 9 patch, I believe I've labeled it. I went and labeled my tiers as different quilting blocks. You know, the 9 patch, the 4 patch, flying geese and stuff like that. But if you're part of the $15 tier, you will go ahead and be able to see the bonus video, the extra length one that goes with this, where I'm going to go ahead and walk you through each and every step, and you're going to watch me cut the fabric and sew the fabric and then put it all together into a quilt. So thank you guys for hanging out with me today, and thank you to all my patrons that have joined, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!